Hi folks, HR Funk here, with a new installment in my continuing series on comparison videos between the Marine Corps' new M18 service pistol and those pistols in the Corps' inventory that it's going to be replacing. In this case, I'm going to be comparing the M18 to the Glock 19. Now I do want to point out here at the beginning of the video that I'm going to be comparing the M18 to the standard Glock 19, not the Glock 19X that was submitted as part of Glock's proposal for the modular handgun system. The reason for that is because I am not trying to compare the M18 to its competitors from the MHS. What I'm doing is comparing the M18 to the current pistols in the Marine Corps' inventory that the M18 is going to be replacing, and one of those is the standard Glock 19. Now, for any of you who might have missed it, about 5 or 6 years ago, the Marine Corps did procure a number of Glock 19s, and I know some of you are aware of it because you sent me links to articles and videos at the time. And I think the common misconception back then was that the Marine Corps was going to be using the Glock 19 to replace the M9A1 pistol that had been in service for several years up to that point. But in researching the information for this video, what I discovered was the Glock 19s that the Marine Corps purchased at that time were only for issue to certain Marines. Among them are Marines that were assigned to plainclothes investigative duties, and this was nothing new, by the way. Back when I was an MP during the 1980s, our military police investigators carried snub-nosed .38 special revolvers because they were more easily concealable than the 1911A1 that we were issued back in those days. So that makes some sense. The full-size M9A1 is a large handgun, and for anyone working in plain clothes that might need a more concealable handgun, those were procured for those investigators. Also, the Glock 19 was going to be issued to Marines who were assigned to the Special Operations Command, or MARSOC, if you will. And I can envision some special operations missions where having a smaller, more concealable handgun might be advantageous. And lastly, and this is the one that puzzled me a little bit, the Glock 19s were going to be issued to the flight crew of HMX-1, the President's helicopter. I don't know why those would have been preferable for the flight crew to the M9A1, but for whatever reason, HMX-1 flight crew personnel were also going to be issued the Glock 19s. So those were really the only Marines that were going to be issued the Glocks. They were not issued Marine Corps-wide. But even so, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the M18 is going to be replacing those Glock 19s in the Marine Corps' inventory, so I thought this comparison was appropriate.
And as you can see, here is the SIG M18, or 320 if you prefer, and the Glock 19 going head-to-head, so to speak. And the first thing that I'll say about these two pistols is they are very similar. In fact, they probably have more similarities than they do differences. They are both striker-fired, polymer-framed, semi-automatic pistols chambered for the 9mm cartridge. They both feed from double-column magazines. The M18, in its standard capacity magazine, has 17 rounds of ammunition, whereas the Glock 19, in its standard magazine, and again, I am comparing the standard Glock 19, has a 15-round magazine, so the M18 picks up a couple of rounds of ammunition capacity, and of course with the 21-round magazines, there's a few more even over and above that. When we look at the construction materials and finish, the SIG pistol has a stainless steel slide that has a rust and corrosion resistant finish applied to it, and the Glock has a carbon steel slide, also with Glock's own finish applied to it, which has been very durable over the years. So I don't know that there's a real advantage, maybe a little bit for the M18 just because it has the stainless steel slide construction, but it's not going to be much of an advantage in terms of construction. Both of these have cold hammer forged barrels. The Glock issued to the Marine Corps, I believe, has Glock's original polygonal rifling, whereas the SIG pistol has standard rifling in those. So for whatever difference that might make, there is a slight difference in the rifling, but I tend to think it's going to be a draw when it comes to accuracy. I don't think either one of these is really going to be significantly more accurate than the other. Starting at the top of our pistols and working our way down, we can see the sights on the SIG pistol. These are the SIG Light night sights, so they do glow in the dark, and they are the 3-dot arrangement. And I could definitely see where having the night sights could be advantageous for our Marines if they're operating in a low light situation. Also, the SIG pistol has the slide cut to accommodate a micro red dot optic, which could also be advantageous in certain situations. For the Glock, and again this is the standard Glock 19, there is no accommodation for the micro red dot. Now I know in the MOS Glocks that's not the case, but again I'm comparing the standard Glock 19, which does not have any accommodation for a micro red dot. It does feature Glock's white outline and white front dot sight, and I find this sight picture to be perfectly adequate for defensive situations. I don't think that it is inferior in any way to the 3-dot system. I think a lot of this just comes down to what individual shooters are accustomed to, but I find them both perfectly functional. Also on top of the M18 slide, we find the loaded chamber indicator, and this is both a tactile and somewhat visible loaded chamber indicator. If it's a low light situation, that's going to be difficult to see, but simply running your finger over the rear of the barrel, you can tell pretty quickly whether or not you have a loaded pistol. Also, the SIG pistol has this raised surface on the extractor, which serves the same exact purpose to give you a tactile loaded chamber indicator. Now, I've said before, I don't think these are very easy to determine whether or not you have a loaded chamber, especially if someone is wearing gloves. Interestingly, that is exactly the same system that Glock uses for a loaded chamber indicator. The surface on the Glock pistol is probably slightly less prominent than the one on the SIG pistol, but even so, I don't like either one of those for trying to determine whether or not you have a loaded round in the chamber, or a round loaded in the chamber rather. But that is the only one that Glock uses on their pistols. Looking at the slide on the SIG pistol, we see that it has fore and aft slide serrations for charging the pistol. And I think the depth and the coarseness of these grooves on the slide, or these serrations on the slide, help to make the SIG pistol a little easier to manipulate the slide. I have always found that the slide on the Glock pistol is kind of slippery, and there have been more than one time that I have grasped the slide to perform a reload and it'll slip and I have to grab it again and recycle it. So I do like the texture of these serrations better on the SIG pistol, and it just seems like I get a better hold on the slide for a more sure load or reload than I do with the Glock. One of the more noticeable differences between these two pistols is the manual safety on the SIG pistol, and this is something that was specified in the MHS contract. And a lot of people will say that you don't need a safety on a pistol like this, which in most cases I tend to agree with. I don't particularly care for having a manually operated safety on a striker fired pistol with essentially a double action only system. However, for general issue to troops with varying degrees of firearms training and pistol training specifically, I can see where having that margin of safety that is provided by the safety could be something that could save various Marines some problems if they would do something that might otherwise cause an accidental discharge. This safety might save them from that difficulty. So for that reason, I can see the manual safety on a general issue pistol for all different sorts of Marines as being somewhat advantageous. In terms of ambidexterity, we can see that the M18 has the ambidextrous safety, also an ambidextrous slide stop, and the magazine catch is reversible. Really, the only thing that is on one side of the gun only is the takedown lever. So otherwise, the M18 is very accommodating for left-handed shooters. And the Glock really is exactly the same. It has the ambidextrous slide stop, the magazine catch is reversible, and when it comes to disassembling the Glock, both sides of the takedown lever have to be pulled down simultaneously So really it's going to work equally well for a right-handed or left-handed shooter. So I think it's pretty much a dead heat when it comes to ambidexterity between these two pistols. Neither one really has an advantage. Moving down to the frame, we can see that the Glock 19 has an equipment rail with a single slot, whereas the M18 has 3 slots to allow a little bit more room for adjusting back and forth the accessories that you might add to the pistol. Both pistols have the squared off trigger guard, which both accommodates a lot of different lights that have switches that come back on either side of the trigger guard, and also it's still there for any shooters that might want to use that finger forward grip that was popular years ago. I don't know how many people still shoot like that, but for anyone who does, both pistols still allow for that. When we look at the magazine release on the M18 is slightly larger than the magazine release on the Glock, and it also just seems to feel a little bit better as I'm disengaging it. The one on the Glock pistol seems kind of stiff. It's not difficult to use. You can obviously reload, and I've done so many times with this pistol, but I just notice it being a little better, or at least just feeling a little bit better on the M18. Looking at the rear of the M18, we can see there's a little bit more prominent grip tang, and this is something that a lot of people don't even notice, but I kind of like it because under recoil, that helps to keep the pistol a little bit more stable in your hand, to give you a little bit faster follow-up shots. On the Glock pistol, there's a somewhat prominent tang there, but not quite as much. It doesn't come back quite as far, so there's not as much leverage to keep the pistol stable to give you those faster shots. Even so, we're talking about shooting a 9mm cartridge, so neither one of these is going to have a tremendous amount of muzzle flip. But I do prefer just having that little bit of additional control afforded by that longer grip tang on the M18. Now we're down to a feature that I will say right off the bat is very subjective, and different shooters are going to have different opinions, and that is the grip design of these two pistols. I prefer the grip on the M18. It fits my hand better, and the pistol points more naturally when I'm holding it in a shooting grip. The SIG pistol has light texturing all the way around. It's not tremendously aggressive, but it is probably adequate. I've never noticed the pistol slipping or sliding around in my hand when I'm shooting it. We can also see that there is a cutout here to make it a little easier for the shooter to be able to reach the trigger. And there's also a fence around the slide stop to try to prevent the shooter from inadvertently locking the slide back during recoil if he or she would get their thumb up underneath there. So all in all, I like the design of the M18's grip. It just feels good to me. Now, the M18 does have a slightly higher bore axis than the Glock 19, and I'll show that in just a moment. So when I was looking at these, and I mentioned this before, I wondered if that was going to result in the feeling of a little bit more muzzle flip, but whether that's dampened by the grip tang or the rest of the design of the grip helps with that, I'm not sure, but I don't notice any additional muzzle flip with the M18. The Glock pistol, and I'm going to be repeating myself again, the grip, I should say, on the Glock pistol has just never fit my hand well, and whenever I bring this into a shooting position, the front sight is always high, and I have to take a moment and lower it in order to get a good sight picture. I've always noticed that with the Glocks. They have never felt good to me, and when I hold the Glock 19 and then switch over to the M18, this just feels so much better to me when I am gripping the pistol. So again, there's a lot of personal preference there, but I do prefer the M18 myself over the grip design on the Glock. The Glock does have a little bit more aggressive texturing as I hold on to that right there. between the front strap, back strap, and the side panels being checkered as they are, it feels like it's a little bit more secure in my hand than the SIG with the lighter texturing. Even so, as I said, I still prefer the way the grip feels on the M18. Speaking of the grips on the pistols, let's go ahead and see if we can get a measurement of the grip circumference. Now obviously with the SIG, if necessary, you could switch out the grip module for a larger or smaller one. But with the standard grip module, it's just about 5.5 inches, maybe just a little bit more than that in circumference. And I'll compare that to the Glock 19. This is always an adventure to do with only one hand. And the Glock 19 is slightly larger, coming in at a little over 5 3/4 inches. And I just realized that wasn't where you could see it, but you have to take my word for it on that one. About 5 3/4 inches for the circumference of the Glock's grip. So when it comes to accommodating shooters with smaller hands, the standard grip module on the M18 is going to work a little bit better. Now let's take a look at the trigger reach. From the back of the grip to the front of the trigger is just over 2.5 inches for the Glock, and just under 2.5 inches for the SIG. So along with being a little bit smaller in circumference, it is slightly less of a reach to get to the trigger of the M18 than it is to get to the trigger of the Glock 19. Taking a look at the very bottom of the grip, we can see that both pistols have a means for grasping the base of the magazine to forcefully pull it out if it would be stuck in the pistol. In the case of the M18, we've got these grooves cut into either side to grab a hold of that if you need to and pull it out of there. For the Glock pistol, there is a cutout in the front of the grip, so you can grab it more on the front and back, and again, pull it out of there if you need to. And I always say when I get to this part that I've never had a situation where I had that much difficulty removing a magazine from a pistol, but if it would be stuck in there from sand or whatever, and you got to get a hold of the thing and yank it out, both pistols do have a means to accomplish that. When we look at the magazines themselves, we see the Glock polymer magazine here, and SIG's steel magazine. Both of these have witness holes, so you can tell how much ammunition is in there. For the SIG, there are only 3 on the standard capacity magazine here. There's an additional one on the 21 round magazine. For the Glock, however, you've got witness holes to be able to see rounds 4 through 15 to know that you've got that ammunition in there and be able to actually see how many rounds you have. I do prefer the steel construction of these magazines, and the reason I say that is because I have seen these Glock magazines fail a couple of times, and in both instances they split down the back of the magazine and ended up jettisoning the ammunition out of there that was inside. With the steel magazines, and I can't even see the seam on this SIG magazine, but these just make me feel a little bit better because I have seen the Glock magazines fail. Now, I'm going to say that's a rare occurrence, so all of you out there who haven't seen that and you've seen Glock magazines that have gone through all kinds of torture testing and never failed or anything, I believe you, but I have seen a couple of them that have done that. Disassembly and ease of maintenance. Now, I want to say at this point, I don't think either one of these pistols is particularly difficult to maintain. There's probably a slight advantage for the SIG, and I'll talk about that momentarily, but there is something I want to point out with regard to the disassembly. And in order to do this, I am going to demonstrate disassembly for these pistols in the video, even though that's possibly going to get this video demonetized. That's one of the things YouTube doesn't like, which is silly because That's just simple disassembly for maintenance and cleaning. I'm not showing any modifications or anything else, but I do think this is important, so I'm going to demonstrate the disassembly. Beginning with the Glock. First, obviously, make certain that it's unloaded, because you are going to have to squeeze the trigger to disassemble the Glock. Then I'm going to retract the slide slightly, pull down on both disassembly levers, move the slide forward off the frame, remove the recoil assembly, and remove the barrel. For the SIG pistol, again, we're going to make sure that it's unlocked. I'm going to lock the slide to the rear, rotate the disassembly lever into the downward position. Then I'm going to release the slide, take it forward off the rails, remove the recoil assembly, and try to remove the barrel. For some reason that's not wanting to come out of there. There we go. Now, between the two disassembly methods, you'll notice they were both very easy to accomplish, but there is a significant difference. And I think this is important, again, when you're talking about a general issue pistol to a lot of different individuals. And that is to disassemble the Glock pistol, the shooter, or hopefully not the shooter, the user has to depress the trigger in order to release the sear to be able to get the slide off of the frame. With the SIG pistol, that's not necessary. In fact, you lock the slide to the rear to give that user an additional chance to look and make sure that there's absolutely no ammunition in the pistol, that the magazine's not in place or anything else, and then simply rotate the disassembly lever down and move the slide forward off the rail. The fact that you don't have to depress the trigger in order to disassemble the SIG, and you do have to with the Glock, again, I think is significant. Now, when it comes to maintenance, as I mentioned a moment ago, I think the SIG pistol does have an advantage. If there's a problem with the fire control module and the pistol has to be repaired, all the armorer has to do is remove the fire control module and replace it with a different one that's functioning properly, and the pistol is going to be back in service in a matter of minutes. That armorer can then take the defective fire control module and, when there's more time later on, figure out what's going on with it and repair it. So I think that's going to make any issues with the fire control easier when it comes to maintenance with the SIG pistols. With the Glock, they are not complicated pistols, but even the best armorer is going to have to disassemble everything, figure out what's going on with it, and then rectify the problem and put it all back together, which is going to take longer than simply replacing that fire control module in the SIG. So that's the maintenance advantage that I see with the SIG pistol. Also, while the pistols are disassembled, we can take a look here. Both barrels are slightly unsupported, or I should say both chambers are slightly unsupported, not drastically, and given the fact that military cartridges have a thicker webbing than commercial cartridges, I don't think either one is going to have a problem with the casing blowing out in that area, but they are both very similar with regard to being slightly unsupported. And reassembly for both pistols is very simple. For the Glock, barrel goes back inside, recoil spring assembly goes back in place, the slide goes onto the frame, and I just lost my light, and the pistol is now reassembled. For the SIG, again, barrel goes back inside, the recoil spring assembly goes back inside. Now, this recoil spring assembly is oblong, it is not round, and it does have to go back in with the proper orientation, and the oblong part has to be in a vertical position. If it's in a horizontal position, it's not going to go back together properly. But that's one thing for a general issue pistol that I think is a little weird. Once the slide goes on, by the way, just simply pull it back, lock it in place, rotate the takedown lever, and the SIG pistol is back together. But that specific orientation for the recoil spring assembly is one thing that I think works against the SIG pistol as a general issue, because sooner or later there's going to be somebody that puts the pistol back together and that thing is going to be turned the wrong way and they're not going to be able to figure out why it doesn't go together. So I think that's a little odd. I'm not sure why it's not circular, but that is one quirk with the M18. When we look at exterior dimensions, we can see that both pistols are very similar in terms of overall length. The SIG pistol is slightly longer by about half the length of the grip tang there, but in really no significant way is one pistol longer or shorter than the other. And by the way, I think this is the reason that the Marine Corps went with the M18 as opposed to the longer M17 pistol, so that those personnel that I mentioned at the beginning of the video will not have to have a separate pistol, but all Marines will have the same pistol, and it will essentially simplify the procurement and maintenance and training to have all Marines carrying the same pistol, and anyone needing the more compact and concealable pistol will be able to use the exact same one as all the other Marines are using for their operations. So again, I think that's the reason the Marine Corps went with the more compact M18. Now, as we see here, the M18 is slightly taller than the Glock 19 by maybe 3/8 of an inch or so. But keep in mind also that the M18 accommodates a 17 round magazine, whereas the standard capacity magazine for the Glock 19 accommodates 15 rounds. So a few more rounds in the magazine for the M18. Now I realize you can get higher capacity magazines for the Glock, but in standard capacity we've got 15 and 17, and also the SIG pistol comes with two 21 round magazines. And that was specified by the government. They wanted a standard capacity magazine and they wanted two higher capacity magazines. So when you purchase one of these, even as a civilian purchaser, you do get the one 17 round magazine and two 21 round magazines. And looking at overall thickness, the Glock 19 might be slightly thinner than the M18. I'm not going to break out the calipers to measure these because I just don't think there's enough difference to make a difference. Let's take a look at weight. The M18 unloaded is just under 1.5 pounds. And with a fully loaded 17 round magazine, it is about 2 pounds 2 ounces, so about 34 ounces for the fully loaded M18. Unloaded, the Glock 19 is slightly lighter than the M18. It is weighing just under 1.5 pounds. That's actually about 22 ounces right there on the official Cabela's scale. And with a fully loaded magazine, it's just under 2 pounds. It's probably about 31 ounces right there that it's weighing with the fully loaded magazine. But keep in mind, that's with a 15 round magazine, whereas the M18 had a couple more rounds in that 17 round magazine. Even so, there's a slight advantage in terms of weight for the Glock 19. So let's compare the triggers between the M18 and the Glock 19. Now I'll say first off that neither one of these pistols has a match grade trigger that you would find in a tuned 1911. And I will also say that trigger pull is something that is rather subjective, and different shooters have a preference for different triggers. Some shooters very much like the stock Glock trigger, and I am not one of them. I don't care for the Glock trigger, I never have. And on these two, the trigger on the SIG M18 has a shorter length of travel, and I'll see if I can show you that. I have to do this left-handed. But that's all the more movement there is with the SIG trigger. Whereas with the Glock, you get the take-up of the drop safety, then that much movement in the trigger, it's still creeping its way back, and then it finally breaks. So I really don't care for the stock Glock trigger. Now that's not to say that it's not serviceable or that people can't shoot accurately with it or anything else. That's not the case at all. I just, as a shooter, do not care for the trigger pull quality of the Glock pistols. And I think the trigger on the M18 has a much cleaner break. There's a little bit of creep with this trigger, but then it breaks pretty cleanly, and I don't really feel any over travel. Again, I'll try to show this so you can see the movement in the trigger. And let me see if I can focus that a little better. There we go. A little bit of creep there. Then a fairly clean break with the SIG. And again, when we look at the Glock, there is the initial take up. It creeps its way, creep, 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 and then finally breaks, and we do see some over travel there. So I don't care for that Glock trigger, and my preference for these two pistols would be for the SIG, but let's weigh them with my trigger pull gauge and see how much difference there is in the actual trigger pull weight between these two pistols. And first up, with the trigger pull gauge, will be the M18. And I'll try to get a good pull, and I'll try to hold this so you can see it. And just under 6 pounds. 5 pounds, 15.7 ounces. As I said, these are not tuned match triggers. I'll try that again. Just under 6 pounds, 5 pounds, 14 ounces. I'll try one more pull. I think I overpulled that a little bit. I think that actually broke just about the same place as it did the last time, around 5 pounds 14 ounces, 5 pounds 15 ounces, but I overpulled it and got an erroneous reading, so I'll try it one more time. Same thing, it broke right around 5 pounds 15 ounces, but still, it's breaking essentially just under 6 pounds for the M18. I'll compare that to the Glock 19. And by the way, if you've never used one of these gauges, there's a little bit of a technique to these things. And trying to get an accurate trigger reading sometimes is a little bit of a challenge. Let's see where the Glock 19 is going to break. Looks like it's breaking just about the same place. I think I overpulled that one a little bit too. I think it broke just under 6 pounds. Again, it's breaking just under 6 pounds. By the time it gets through the over travel with the trigger and comes to rest, it's registering over 6 pounds, but it's actually breaking just below there. So they're both almost exactly the same when it comes to the trigger pull weight. They're both breaking just right at or slightly under 6 pounds. But of the two, as I said before, I still prefer the trigger on the M18. When it comes to combat effectiveness between these two pistols, which I would define as simply the ability to reliably launch a bullet at an enemy, I don't think there's any real practical difference between these two. When it comes to accuracy, as I said earlier in the video, both of them have adequate sights. I think mechanical accuracy between the two is very comparable. I think the reliability for both pistols is good, and I think the only real limiting factor with these two pistols when it comes to combat effectiveness is the skill set of the shooter who is using either one or the other. So is the Marine Corps really getting a better pistol with the M18 than they already have with the Glock 19? Well, I have a feeling that will be debated for a long time to come. But in my opinion, with the M18, they are getting a pistol with slightly better ergonomics that is going to accommodate more shooters with different size hands, especially if they're able to obtain different size grip modules. They're getting a pistol with a slightly better degree of safety because of the manual safety, and also because the trigger does not have to be depressed in order to disassemble the pistol. They're getting a pistol that's slightly easier to maintain because, as I said, if there's a problem with the fire control module, it can be simply removed and replaced. They're getting a pistol that will accommodate a micro red dot optic if that becomes necessary for a given mission. And they will only need to inventory one size pistol instead of getting a full-size pistol for some Marines and a compact pistol for other Marines.
And that's going to do it for my comparison video between the M18 and the Glock 19. I hope you enjoyed it. If you have any questions or comments, as always, make sure you forward those to me. Remember, if you purchase anything from Optics Planet, be sure to use my discount code, which is... And if you use that discount code, it's good for 5% off anything you purchase from Optics Planet. Also remember, WarbirdBunker.com is making t-shirts for the channel. If you're interested in my t-shirt or any of the other firearms or patriotic themed gear that Nathan has at WarbirdBunker.com, be sure to go there and use my discount code HRFUNK4U, and you get 10% off anything you order from WarbirdBunker.com. See you next time, folks. And until then, good shooting. Bye-bye.